When the empath stops forgiving, watch. Every mask fall, you know there's something profound that happens when an empath finally says, enough. It's not dramatic. There's no explosion, no grand announcement. It's actually quite quiet. But the ripple effects, they're extraordinary. Today we're exploring what Carl Jung would call one of the most significant psychological transformations a person can undergo. Because when someone who has spent their entire life absorbing others' pain, excusing others' behavior, and prioritizing everyone else's comfort finally stops forgiving indiscriminately, something remarkable occurs. The masks that people have been wearing around them suddenly become visible, and more importantly, they start falling. Let's begin with understanding what we mean by an empath in psychological terms. Jung described certain individuals as having what he called psychological porosity, an almost supernatural ability to sense and absorb the emotional states of others. These aren't just sensitive people. These are individuals whose nervous systems seem calibrated to pick up on subtleties that others miss entirely. Jung observed that such individuals often develop what he termed compensatory forgiveness, a psychological mechanism where they excuse harmful behavior because they can sense the pain beneath it. They see the wounded child in the aggressive adult. They feel the fear behind the control. They understand the trauma that drives the manipulation. But here's what Jung also discovered through his clinical work. This extraordinary capacity for understanding and forgiveness, when applied without boundaries, creates a unique psychological environment around the empath. Other people begin to rely on this forgiveness. They start to take it for granted. And slowly, unconsciously, they begin to show their authentic selves. Not because they're comfortable being vulnerable, but because they know their behavior will be absorbed, understood, and ultimately excused. Think of it this way. When someone knows they won't face genuine consequences for their actions, they stop moderating those actions. The empath becomes a kind of psychological safety net, allowing others to express their shadow selves without fear of rejection or abandonment. Jung wrote extensively about what he called the persona, the mask we wear in social situations, but he noted something fascinating. The persona isn't just about hiding our flaws, it's also about managing others' reactions to us. When we're around someone who we believe will always forgive us, always understand us, always give us another chance, the persona becomes unnecessary. We can let it slip because we feel safe. This is why empaths often see sides of people that others never witness. They're not necessarily better judges of character. They're creating conditions where character reveals itself authentically. But what happens when this dynamic suddenly shifts? What occurs when the empath finally reaches what Jung called the psychological breaking point, that moment when self-preservation finally overrides the compulsion to forgive? The transformation is remarkable. It typically begins with what appears to be a minor incident. Someone takes advantage of the empath's kindness one more time. There's another broken promise, another expectation that they'll simply absorb the disappointment and move on. But this time, something is different. This time, the empath doesn't automatically shift into understanding mode. They don't immediately search for reasons to excuse the behavior. Instead, for perhaps the first time, they simply observe. They witness the action without the immediate impulse to forgive it. And in that moment of clear observation, something profound occurs. They see the behavior for exactly what it is, stripped of all the psychological explanations and emotional cushioning they've been providing. Jung described this as a moment of radical clarity, when the fog of compensatory empathy lifts and reality becomes visible in sharp relief. The empath suddenly sees patterns they've been unconsciously overlooking. They recognize manipulation they've been reframing as pain. They identify exploitation they've been interpreting as need. But the real revelation isn't about others' behavior, it's about their own. They begin to understand that their unlimited forgiveness hasn't been helping anyone. In fact, it's been enabling dysfunction and preventing growth. Jung believed that facing consequences is essential for psychological development. By constantly providing forgiveness without requiring change, the empath has been inadvertently stunting others' emotional evolution. This realization typically leads to what we might call the great withdrawal. The empath begins to step back, not out of anger or resentment, but out of a newfound understanding of healthy boundaries. They stop automatically excusing behavior. They stop immediately offering forgiveness. They start allowing natural consequences to occur. And this is when the masks begin to fall. You see, Many people in the empath's life have grown accustomed to a particular dynamic. They've learned that certain behaviors will be tolerated, certain words will be forgiven, certain patterns will be overlooked. Their personas have been calibrated specifically for this relationship. They've been operating under the assumption that the empath's understanding and forgiveness are guaranteed. When that assumption is suddenly challenged, panic sets in. The comfortable psychological environment they've grown dependent on disappears. Suddenly, their actions have real consequences. Their words carry actual weight. They can no longer rely on the empath's emotional labor to smooth over the rough edges of their behavior. Jung observed that when someone's psychological safety net is removed, their authentic self emerges rapidly, not always in pleasant ways. People who have seemed reasonable and controlled may become demanding and manipulative. Those who appeared grateful and loving might reveal themselves to be entitled and exploitative. The gentle victim might transform into an aggressive predator. This isn't because they're fundamentally bad people. It's because they've been operating in an artificial environment where their shadow aspects were being consistently absorbed and neutralized by someone else. When that buffer is removed, those shadow aspects suddenly become visible to everyone, not just the empath. The empath, meanwhile, is undergoing their own profound transformation. Jung wrote about what he called the integration of the shadow self, the process of accepting and incorporating the parts of ourselves we've been rejecting or suppressing. For many empaths, this includes learning to access their own capacity for firmness, their ability to say no, their right to prioritize their own needs. This integration often feels uncomfortable at first. Empaths are used to being the ones who bend, who accommodate, who sacrifice for harmony. Learning to hold firm boundaries can feel selfish or cruel. But Jung emphasized that this integration is essential for psychological wholeness. Without it, the empath remains trapped in a pattern that ultimately serves no one. Let me share what Jung observed about this process in his clinical practice. He worked with numerous individuals who exhibited what we now recognize as empathic traits. These patients would arrive in his office exhausted, depleted, unable to understand why their relationships felt so draining despite their best efforts to be understanding and forgiving. One pattern Jung noticed was what he called emotional vampirism. Though not in any supernatural sense, he observed that certain individuals would unconsciously seek out empathic people precisely because they could deposit their emotional burdens without reciprocal responsibility. The empath would absorb their anxiety, their anger, their shame, and process it for them. The other person would leave feeling lighter, while the empath remained heavy with emotions that weren't originally their own. Jung realized that this dynamic prevented both parties from achieving psychological maturity. The empath never learned to protect their own emotional space, while the other person never developed the skills to process their own emotions independently. It was a form of codependency that masqueraded as compassion. When Jung's empathic patients began to establish boundaries, to stop automatically absorbing others' emotions and forgiving harmful behaviors, the reactions they encountered revealed something startling. Many of the people in their lives responded not with understanding or respect, but with anger, manipulation, or attempts to guilt them back into their old role. This reaction pattern taught Jung something crucial about human psychology. We don't just wear masks to hide our flaws from others. We also maintain relationships that allow us to avoid confronting our own psychological work. The empath's automatic forgiveness had been enabling others to avoid the difficult but necessary process of self-reflection and growth. Jung documented how this realization often came as a shock to his empathic patients. They had believed they were helping others by being so understanding and forgiving. Instead, they discovered they had been participating in what Jung termed mutual psychological stagnation. Neither party was growing because the dynamic didn't require growth from anyone. As this transformation progresses, something beautiful begins to happen. The relationships that survive this shift, the ones where people are willing to adjust their behavior rather than simply demanding the return of unconditional forgiveness, these relationships become deeper and more authentic than ever before. When people can no longer rely on the empath's automatic understanding, they're forced to develop their own emotional intelligence. They must learn to communicate clearly, to take responsibility for their actions, to develop genuine empathy rather than simply expecting it from others. But the process isn't without its challenges. Jung observed that empaths going through this transformation often experienced what he called guilt attacks. intense periods of self-doubt, where they questioned whether they were becoming too harsh or selfish. This guilt was particularly strong because empaths had often been praised throughout their lives for their understanding nature. To suddenly set boundaries felt like betraying their core identity. Jung helped his patients understand that this guilt was actually a sign of healthy psychological development. It indicated they were breaking free from unconscious patterns and making conscious choices about how to direct their empathy. The discomfort they felt was the growing pains of psychological maturity. One of the most profound shifts Jung documented was how empaths began to experience their own emotions more clearly once they stopped absorbing everyone else's. Many discovered they had been carrying so much emotional debris from others that they had lost touch with their own authentic feelings. As they established boundaries, their emotional landscape became clearer and more distinct. This clarity allowed them to develop what Jung called conscious compassion, empathy that was offered intentionally rather than compulsively. They learned to feel others' pain without automatically taking responsibility for healing it. They could witness others' struggles without immediately jumping in to fix or excuse them. The impact on their relationships was immediate and revealing. Some people, when faced with an empath who no longer offered automatic forgiveness, responded by improving their behavior. They began to consider the impact of their actions more carefully. They started taking responsibility for their mistakes without expecting immediate absolution. These relationships evolved into healthier, more balanced connections. Others, however, could not adapt to the new dynamic. These individuals had become so dependent on the empath's emotional labor that they were unwilling or unable to develop their own emotional capabilities. They might become angry, accusatory, or manipulative in their attempts to restore the old pattern. They would claim the empath had changed or become selfish, attempting to guilt them back into their former role. Jung understood this reaction as resistance to psychological growth. These individuals had been using the empath's forgiveness as a way to avoid facing their own shadow aspects, the parts of themselves they preferred not to acknowledge. When that avoidance mechanism was removed, they experienced psychological discomfort and sought to restore their comfort by pressuring the empath to resume their old role. The empath's ability to recognize and resist these manipulation attempts marked a crucial stage in their development. Jung noted that empaths often struggled with this recognition because they were accustomed to giving others the benefit of the doubt. Learning to identify emotional manipulation required them to accept that some people might intentionally use their empathy against them, a difficult realization for someone whose worldview had been built on assuming others' good intentions. This recognition led to what Jung termed the Great Sorting, a natural process where relationships reorganized themselves based on their authentic foundations. Relationships built on mutual respect and genuine care deepened and strengthened. Relationships that had been based on the empath's one-sided emotional labor either transformed or dissolved. Jung observed that this sorting process, while sometimes painful, was ultimately liberating for the empath. They discovered which relationships truly valued them as a person, rather than merely as an emotional resource. They learned to distinguish between people who cared about their well-being and those who only cared about what they could provide. As the empath's transformation continued, Jung noticed they began to develop what he called energetic discernment, an ability to sense which interactions would be nourishing versus depleting before fully engaging in them. This wasn't about becoming cold or calculating, but rather about becoming conscious of how they invested their emotional energy. This discernment extended to their forgiveness practices. Rather than forgiving automatically and immediately, they began to assess whether forgiveness was appropriate and beneficial in each situation. They considered factors like whether the person had acknowledged their mistake, shown genuine remorse, taken steps to avoid repeating the behavior, or demonstrated respect for the empath's boundaries. Jung emphasized that this selective approach to forgiveness wasn't about becoming punitive or withholding. It was about making forgiveness meaningful again. When forgiveness is offered regardless of the recipient's attitude or behavior, it loses its transformative power. It becomes empty rather than healing. The empath learned to offer what Jung called earned forgiveness, forgiveness that came after acknowledgement, accountability, and evidence of change. This type of forgiveness carried weight because it was based on reality rather than wishful thinking. It honored both the harm that had been done and the genuine effort required for repair. This shift had a profound impact on how others perceived the empath's forgiveness. When it could no longer be taken for granted, it became precious. People began to work harder to earn it, which meant they engaged more seriously with their own behavior and its consequences. Jung documented how this change affected the empath's sense of self-worth. Many had unconsciously believed that their value lay primarily in their ability to forgive and understand others. When they began to offer these gifts selectively, they discovered that their worth wasn't dependent on their utility to others. They had value simply by virtue of being human. This realization often triggered what Jung called identity reconstruction, a process where the empath had to discover who they were beyond their role as emotional caretaker. They began to explore their own interests, preferences, and needs without constantly filtering them through others' potential reactions. Many empaths discovered they had been living what Jung termed a borrowed life, making decisions based on what would keep others comfortable rather than what would serve their own growth and happiness. As they began to reclaim their authentic preferences, they sometimes surprised themselves with desires and ambitions they had suppressed or never allowed themselves to acknowledge. The masks that fell during this transformation revealed not just others' hidden faces, but the empath's own authentic self. They discovered who they were when they weren't constantly adapting to others' needs. They learned what their own voice sounded like when it wasn't always harmonizing with others' demands. This process of self-discovery often revealed talents and capabilities that had been dormant, while the empath focused primarily on caretaking others. Jung observed that many of his empathic patients had been underutilizing their intellectual, creative, or leadership abilities because so much of their energy had been directed toward emotional labor for others. As they reclaimed this energy and directed it toward their own development, they often experienced rapid growth in areas that had been neglected. They might discover artistic talents, intellectual interests, or professional ambitions that had been overshadowed by their focus on others' needs. This personal growth had an interesting effect on their relationships. People who had been accustomed to the empath being primarily available as an emotional resource suddenly encountered someone with their own rich inner life and pursuits. Some found this new dimension intriguing and were inspired to develop their own neglected aspects. Others felt threatened by the empath's independence and growth. Jung noted that this reaction served as another form of mask removal. People who genuinely cared about the empath celebrated their growth and supported their journey toward wholeness. Those who saw the empath primarily as a resource for their own needs felt disturbed by the reduced availability of that resource. The transformation also affected how the empath handled conflict. Previously, they might have immediately moved to smooth over disagreements, apologize for others' discomfort, or sacrifice their own position to restore harmony. Now they began to allow conflict to exist when it served a purpose, when it revealed important truths or created necessary pressure for change. Jung understood that conflict, while uncomfortable, often serves essential psychological functions. It can reveal hidden dynamics, force important conversations, and create the tension necessary for growth. The empath's previous pattern of immediately resolving all conflict had been preventing these beneficial outcomes. Learning to tolerate and even utilize conflict constructively required the empath to overcome deep conditioning. Many had been taught from childhood that their role was to keep others happy and comfortable. Allowing others to experience discomfort, even discomfort that might lead to positive change, went against their ingrained instincts. But Jung helped his patients understand that protecting others from all discomfort wasn't kindness. It was a form of control that prevented growth. True compassion sometimes meant allowing people to face the natural consequences of their choices, even when those consequences were uncomfortable. This shift in perspective transformed how the empath responded to others' emotional states. Previously, they might have felt responsible for managing others' anxiety, anger, or sadness. Now they could offer support without taking ownership of others' emotional experiences. The result was relationships where each person took responsibility for their own emotional regulation while offering appropriate support to others. This created space for authentic intimacy, based on choice rather than need, on mutual care rather than one-sided caretaking. Jung observed that as empaths developed these healthier relationship patterns, they often attracted different types of people into their lives. Their increased boundaries and self-respect drew individuals who were also committed to personal growth and mutual respect in relationships. Meanwhile, People who had been drawn to the empath's previous unlimited availability often naturally drifted away when they realized the dynamic had permanently changed. This wasn't usually a conscious decision on anyone's part. It was simply the natural result of incompatible relationship styles. The empath's transformation created a ripple effect that extended beyond their immediate relationships. Family members, colleagues, and friends witnessed someone who had been perpetually self-sacrificing, suddenly modeling healthy boundaries and self-respect. This example often inspired others to examine their own relationship patterns and consider making changes. Jung noted that empaths often became inadvertent teachers of healthy relationship dynamics simply by living them. Their journey from unconscious caretaking to conscious compassion provided a roadmap that others could follow in their own healing work. As we near the end of our exploration today, it's important to understand that this transformation isn't about becoming cold or withholding love. It's about loving consciously rather than compulsively. It's about offering empathy as a gift rather than an automatic response. It's about creating space for others to grow by not constantly cushioning them from the natural consequences of their actions. Jung believed that the highest form of love isn't protection from life's challenges, but support in facing them. The empath who stops forgiving automatically is offering this higher form of love, not just to others, but to themselves. When the masks fall, what's revealed isn't always beautiful, but it's always honest. And Jung understood that honesty, even uncomfortable honesty, is the foundation upon which authentic relationships and genuine personal growth must be built. The empath's transformation creates space for this honesty to emerge and for real healing to begin. The journey from unconscious empathy to conscious compassion represents one of the most courageous psychological transformations a person can undertake. It requires facing uncomfortable truths about relationships, challenging ingrained patterns, and risking the loss of connections that may have felt essential to one's identity. But the reward is profound. The discovery of authentic selfhood, the development of truly intimate relationships based on mutual respect, and the ability to offer one's gifts from a place of strength rather than depletion. When the empath stops forgiving indiscriminately, they don't lose their capacity for compassion. They transform it into something more powerful, more healing, and more sustainable. The masks that fall reveal the truth that was always there, waiting to be acknowledged, and in that truth both the empath and those around them find the possibility for genuine growth, authentic connection, and lasting transformation. The masks that fall reveal the truth that was always there, waiting to be acknowledged, and in that truth both the empath and those around them find the possibility for genuine growth, authentic connection, and lasting transformation. Now, I want you to think about your own journey for a moment. Maybe you're recognizing yourself in this transformation, or perhaps you're seeing someone close to you who's been through this awakening. The psychological shift we've explored today isn't just theory. It's happening in real lives, in real relationships right now. This community we're building here understands these deep psychological patterns because we've lived them. We've felt that moment when clarity cuts through years of unconscious giving. We've witnessed the shock on people's faces when our unlimited forgiveness suddenly had limits. And we've experienced the profound relief that comes with finally honoring our own emotional needs. Your insights matter deeply to this conversation. In the comments below, share this powerful phrase: "The day I stopped forgiving everything was the day I started healing everything." This simple statement captures the essence of conscious compassion. And when others see it, they'll immediately understand that you're someone who's moved beyond unconscious empathy into intentional love. Every single person who resonates with this message creates a ripple effect of awareness. When you hit that like button, you're not just supporting this content, you're amplifying a message that could reach someone who desperately needs to understand that their worth isn't measured by how much they can absorb from others. Your engagement becomes part of their healing journey, just as this community has become part of yours. The subscribe button represents something deeper than just staying updated. It's your commitment to continued psychological growth, to understanding the intricate patterns that shape human behavior, and to being part of a community that values authentic transformation over comfortable illusions. When you subscribe, you're telling yourself and others that you're ready for more truth, more insight, more opportunities to see through the masks that surround us all. What we're uncovering next will challenge everything you thought you knew about another fundamental human experience. we're going to explore a psychological phenomenon that's so universally experienced, yet so deeply misunderstood, that most people spend their entire lives trapped within it, without ever recognizing the pattern. The research Jung conducted in this area revealed something that completely transforms how we understand human motivation and behavior. This next revelation will show you why certain people seem to effortlessly draw others toward them, while others, despite their best efforts, always seem to push people away. The psychological mechanism we'll uncover explains patterns you've noticed your entire life, but never had the framework to understand. Once you see this pattern clearly, you'll never look at human interaction the same way again. The transformation continues, and your awareness is the key that unlocks each new level of understanding. We're building something powerful here together, a community of people who refuse to accept surface explanations for the complex realities of human psychology. Your journey toward conscious living is just beginning, and what comes next will take you even deeper into the hidden mechanisms that drive human behavior.